Welcome everyone to our roundtable discussion presented by the WILPF US Middle East Peace and Justice Action Committee. I'm Barbara Taft, committee co-chair. The topic today is how WILPF can change US policy on the Middle East. US policy and actions toward the many issues of WILPF the many issues of the Middle East are detrimental to our goal of achieving peace and justice in the region. Our speakers today, most members of our committee, will highlight several issues, explaining what the problems are and suggesting potential solutions, ways that we can work to solve those problems. We also welcome your input in a discussion during the second part of our presentation time, along with our Q&A. Our committee is tasked with working on problems in perhaps the most contentious area of the world. Much of our work involves the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but the issues encountered there are mirrored in other regional conflicts, currently including Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iran, and others. We will look at several major issues, with each speaker addressing specific problems that can be identified. Each will then look at some potential solutions we can try in order to correct US policy regarding that issue. A list of how you can take action will be made available. Some specific things that our committee has done recently include a Zoom webinar with our sisters in the Lebanon section of WILPF on the situation in that beleaguered country, several e-news articles on the situation in the West Bank and Gaza, the crisis in Yemen, and other topics. We have also campaigned in favor of the passage of Minnesota Congresswoman Betty McCollum's H.R. 2590, which is called the Defending the Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Israeli Military Occupation Act. And we've worked against the annexation by Israel of additional Palestinian land in the Jordan Valley, most of which is fertile farmland. We've also linked the Israeli separation wall that cuts through Palestinian towns and neighborhoods with the wall on the southern US border with Mexico that separates people and magnifies the fears that they have of one another when they're prevented from getting to know each other, and how that prevents both understanding and peacemaking. We also have a major project trying to get Hamas removed from the US list of terrorist organizations and to restart the peace talks in the Middle East with all parties participating. These projects have kept us busy, and we're always looking for more people to join our committee and help us in these efforts. We'd like to call your attention to two events at Congress tomorrow, Sunday, August 22nd. So at Congress tomorrow at 10:20 a.m., our member Nada Farhat, who is also a member of our Lebanon section, will be showing a video, Lebanon, the Forgotten Country, which contains interviews of female refugees in Lebanon. She will be joined by two members of the Lebanon section who will also answer questions. And right after that, at 11:10 a.m., Jen Korderman is hosting a discussion with Daoud Nasser about keeping hope alive in Palestine with projects like his Tent of Nations near Bethlehem. We asked Michigan Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who is a Palestinian American, to record a few words as our introduction. Her recorded message will be followed by our first speaker, Odile Hugonot-Haber, who co-chairs this committee with me, and who will talk about US weapons sales to the Middle East and how detrimental they are. The second speaker is Charlotte Dennett, speaking about the role of oil and pipelines and how that links to militarization and chaos in the region. Marlena Santoyo will then read a poem by a Palestinian woman held in an Israeli prison who was not able to attend her own daughter's funeral. Then we will hear from Desmura Gatewood, whose topic is the importance of Black and Palestinian solidarity. She's made a recent trip to the region and will tell us about what she learned there. Our last speaker will be me, Barbara Taft, talking about our Hamas booklet project and the need for peace talks to resume with the object that the parties living in the region need to decide their own future. Each speaker will present for approximately 7 minutes, and after all the speakers have completed their talks, we'll have time for questions and discussion. You may want to write your questions down that you want to ask later, because we're not going to answer questions right after each speaker. You're welcome to enter them in the chat, but please try to not write in the chat very much, because it does tend to disrupt when a speaker is speaking. After the speaker has ended, then take a quick chance to write in the chat if that's possible for you. And our discussion, when that takes place, will be coordinated by Joan Goddard, and she'll be monitoring your questions. So now let's hear from Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman from Michigan, who has given us a very nice message. So, can we get?
Salams, ahlan wa sahlan. I'm Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. Thank you so much to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom for inviting me to share space with all of you. I so incredibly appreciate the opportunity to speak about something I'm passionate about, which is Palestinian liberation. As you all know, I have family in the West Bank, in the occupied territories. And it's also not only my beloved, beautiful grandmother, my Siti, but it's also my aunts, my cousins, my uncles, and so many more that deserve human dignity, not only in the workplace, but even in their own homes. And so it's so important that as I get asked continually what else we can do to promote that, not only Palestinian liberation, but really liberation of all people and pushing back against human rights abuses. I know this. I grew up in the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, in the United States. And every corner is a reminder of the civil rights movement, the labor rights movement. And it's people on the ground that demanded that change. No matter who was in the White House or who was in Congress, it was that movement work on the ground where it was teach-ins, marches, protests, op-eds from just regular folks that were speaking that truth that needed to be said so that we can truly free people from painful oppression. And so when people ask what else we can do, I am always reminded of what an African-American Baptist pastor have said in my community. He said that we're not a country that is divided, but disconnected. And that can be applied globally, that our movements for immigrant rights, for women's rights, for the push against poverty and other injustices, that it is connected to other liberation movements. And so for us, we cannot wait until it's our community that is impacted by oppressive policies. We have to speak up. So when I look at the beautiful, massive Black Lives Matter movement that has reached globally, I love to see the crowd full of people that are not just Black. They are Latino. They are so many different other backgrounds. And that to me is what strengthens movement and actually transforms policy and changes. And so here at home in the United States, I know this. I know that it is those interconnections that is really raising the bar of what we expect when people speak about true freedom for everyone that lives in Palestine and Israel. And for us to all truly understand that, we need to be intentional about how we connect with each other. And so my fight for water as a human right is something that here at home I'm pushing against water shutoffs, but I know that it is so connected to pushing, making sure that folks in Gaza have water. And I always say this, I say cutting people off of water is violence. It is true violence when you take away something that is life, and water is life. And so I know that, again, you all are working towards that, but it is not that complex. When people ask me and I respond that way, they kind of look at me and I tell them, don't underestimate the power of connection, a connection that can happen with movement. And I saw it in the migrant rights movement. I saw it during the labor rights movement. It's when we all do it together that we can truly see transformative change in policy. So thank you all so much for this opportunity, and know that you always have a partner and someone that speaks truth to power, even when my voice shakes, even as the attacks come. I can't see myself doing anything but that. And I do it not only for my grandmother, but for all the mothers that raised me in this beautiful, beautiful district of mine in the 13th. So thank you again. Take care. Please be safe. Salam.
This is a wonderful message. Thank you.
Yes. Many thanks to Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. I think that's a very good start for what we're going to be talking about. She touched on many of our issues and many WILPF issues as well. So we're ready for our first speaker, and that's our committee co-chair, Odile Hugonot-Haber, who is actually speaking to us from France right now, where it's the middle of the night. So pay attention to her. She'll be speaking about US weapons sales to the Middle East. Odile, go ahead.
Well, it just follows a wonderful workshop we had just earlier from Disarm. So the Middle East contains many countries, as you know, and in the last few years, due to wars, bombing, and drone strike, millions of people have died, and many have been maimed or become refugees in the Middle East due to United States weapon and US intervention. In Yemen now, a child dies every 10 minutes due to current wars. The US sell weapons to the Saudi and they are engaged in this war in Yemen with a very large coalition of many countries. The US has been supplying weapons and logistical support to this coalition while supporting a blockade against the importation of food and medical supplies, which caused the civilian population to develop food starvation and suffer outbreak of cholera and other contagious disease, as well as COVID-19. The cost of this wanton destruction of the Middle East has been over 6.4 trillion since 9/11, and it seems that the US military budget costs are still rising way out of scale. The United States is the single greatest arms supplier to the Middle East by volume and value, and it has been for decades. However, other major producers like Russia, France, China are also key players in the region. In 2016, the United States and Israeli government signed their third, number 3, 10 years memorandum of understanding called MOU on military aid. And from 2019 to 2028, under the term of MOU, the United States pledged to provide, subject to congressional appropriation, of course, 38 billion in military aid to Israel, 33 billion in foreign aid financing grant, and 5 billion in missile defense appropriation to Israel. A 64-page report written for congressional representative by the Congressional Research Service is entitled Arms Sale in the Middle East, Trends and Analytical Perspective for US Policy 2020 can be found. I'll send the link. To date, the United States has provided 1.6 billion to Israel just for Iron Dome, battery, interceptor, co-production cost, and general maintenance. Because Iron Dome was developed by Israel alone, Israel initially retained proprietary technology rights to it. The United States and Israel have had for decade-long partnership in the development and co-production of other missile defense systems, such as the Arrow defense system. US-based Raytheon Corporation is with Israel's Rafael, US partner in the co-production of Iron Dome congressional report. Israel is also listed as a top arms sale country, selling arms to China and many countries around the world. Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran are under the rule of dictators. Lebanon, we are told, is ruled by undemocratic mafia-like groups. So even though the US claimed to use arms sales and aid to promote US interest and influence policy, we cannot say that democracy is growing in the Middle East. We have 5 avenues to fight against arms sale, and in the last workshop, they did speak about this. Inform your representative, move the money invested in your retirement, divest from the corporations that are working on armament, and invest in other corporations that sustain life. Divest your town fund, such as Cambridge did, and follow the divest, boycott, and sanction. We can only try to put pressure on our government to keep democracy alive and to reduce arms sale in favor of real human security, clean and accessible water, food, education, health. We promote the engagement of civil society. To reduce arms sale and invest in climate change is a must, not only because military intervention is the #1 agent in primary cause of climate change, but because it is a must for the human species to survive. What we hope to be working toward is a weapon of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, which means we could get rid of that region of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. We would do that by supporting 1, the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, 2, the new Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, the Chemical Weapon Convention, CWC, and 4, the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention, BTWC. Then the Middle East would have a chance to move towards peace, and so the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Odile. And for those of you who have any questions for her, this is a good time to write them into the chat if you need to do that. And it is such a wonderful idea, and Odile has been working on this for a long time, that we want to have a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to have? So just thank you again, Odile. Our next speaker is Charlotte Dennett. Charlotte is a journalist, author, and attorney, and she's going to be talking about the role of oil and pipelines and how that links to militarization.
I recently published this book. It's the work of decades, and the crash. I'm going to explain the title, and then you'll see the relevance to the Middle East. The crash killed 6 Americans in Ethiopia in 1947. One of them was my father, and he was the lost spy. He was America's sole master spy in the Middle East. And he had just completed a top secret mission to Saudi Arabia, but he never made it. The plane crashed. I was 6 weeks old. I grew up in Massachusetts, but later became a journalist in Lebanon. That's when I began to put some of the pieces together about my father, starting to explode some myths about the Middle East. One of the first was that the Levant, those are the countries bordering the Eastern Mediterranean. Levant stands for east, or the sun rising in the east. So when I was there as a journalist, I was told it was the gateway to the Middle East. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that to oil men, it was something different. It was the gateway to Middle East oil. And I've drawn this rectangle, and if you look very carefully at the map, you will see that some of the major oil producers, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, they impinge upon these little states on the Eastern Mediterranean. And what are they? Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. So just keep that in mind. Then I did some investigation through the New York Times and discovered that Saudi oil was vital to rebuilding devastated Western Europe. The Trans-Arabian pipeline was to send Saudi oil to a terminal point somewhere on the Eastern Mediterranean, preferably Palestine or Lebanon. I learned this was a very big deal, fraught with political intrigue. From the article, oil concessions raise questions involving position of Russia. So you can already see the beginning of the Cold War. And isn't it interesting that we're still concerned about that? The other thing that was really interesting in this article was that the protection of the pipeline would be a prime objective of American foreign policy and a focal point of rivalry between East and West. So the protection is military protection, which of course ties into our earlier talks on the huge military expenditures that go into this region. One of the things I'm arguing is that's to protect the oil. This is that same map recreated that shows 3 pipelines. The lower one is the Trans-Arabian pipeline, is dotted, and it goes from Saudi Arabia to Lebanon. Then you'll see a fork of a pipeline that is carrying oil from Iraq. The southern fork goes to Haifa, Palestine, and it was British controlled after World War I. The northern pipeline goes to Tripoli in northern Lebanon, and that was controlled by the Syrians. They created their separate so-called mandates, dividing up the Middle East according to their own interests, the French mandate and the British mandate after World War I. While I was doing my investigation, I wasn't looking at those pipelines, but later on, I came back to them and I was wondering, when were they built? Well, they were built in 1933, but when were they conceived and planned? This took me farther back in history, and I had to go to World War I, and when seizing the oil of Iraq became Britain's first-class war aim. This is a fact that's not well known. Most people don't look at the war in the Middle East during World War I, but it was very crucial. Why? Because the British had just converted its fuel source from coal, of which Britain had plenty, to oil, of which Britain had none. And Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour declared it's all important that this oil be available. Even Winston Churchill predicted when he made this conversion from coal to oil that Britain would have to take up arms on a sea of trouble to get oil, and he was right. Iraq was the great prize of World War I. But then I kept thinking, how was this oil going to be piped to market? Now we come into a very famous document called the Balfour Declaration, which states that the British government favors a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It's actually just a letter between him and Baron de Rothschild, who was a scion of one of the most important oil dynasties in Europe. So there's an oil connection to the Balfour Declaration that people are just beginning to realize. Lo and behold, Palestine was deemed the perfect place to terminate that pipeline, and you've already seen it on the map. And one of these recent authors in the tragedy of Zionism indicates Haifa was an ideal port and the natural place for a pipeline bringing oil to the east. So what I'm saying, and I think this is really important, you got to re-examine the whole premise for the creation of Israel. Was it solely to help Jewish victims of the Holocaust, or was there a geopolitical imperative? That southern branch of the pipeline terminated in Palestine, a region that would be occupied by European Jews. The northern French-controlled pipeline terminated in a region, Lebanon, that was headed by a Christian president. In short, I call it a Judeo-Christian alliance that avoided Muslim countries for security reasons. Now, in this map, you see the two pipelines, and it turns out that the invasion of Iraq by the US was partly inspired by the Israelis, who wanted to restore the southern pipeline to Haifa. And Netanyahu even said it's not a pipe dream. The pipeline had closed in 1948. He wanted it reopened. He had this whole grand scheme and it failed. I can tell you more about the scheme, but I'm running out of time. You'll also see that the British and Australian troops were deployed there to protect the airfields along the pipeline. In fact, all the first military moves in the invasion of Iraq were to protect oil installations. Now we come to the Eastern Mediterranean and we look at it through a new lens. There's all this new oil and gas that's been discovered off the coast. And as my book explains, the two Israeli attacks on Gaza in 2007 and 2011 were to prevent it from having access to the natural gas in what is called the Gaza Marine. The argument was that the money from the sale of the gas would go to creating more terrorists. Of course, the Palestinians had put their hopes into this gas as improving their economy. The Israelis do not want it. They have their generals have said we'll bomb them back to the Stone Age, but they're not getting that gas. And now they're thinking of building a pipeline across the Mediterranean to take advantage of this huge Leviathan field to the north, which belongs to Israel. My father warned in 1943, God help us if we ever send troops to the Middle East. I think he had a premonition of things to come. The great game for oil continues, and it includes Afghanistan. I'll just end on this. You wonder if this was the good war? Well, I've got energy to show that the purpose of sending troops into Afghanistan was so the energy can flow south. And that's a quote from an assistant of the State Department. You're looking now at the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. It's supposed to traverse Afghanistan. Those little balloons that pop up are all military bases. Note that they're there along the route of the pipeline. And Canadian troops, you can't see it well on the map, were also posted there and suffered serious casualties. And so a Canadian who served with the World Bank in the past, and even BP, was the one that blew the whistle that the purpose of the invasion was to protect this major energy project. And guess what? Can you guess? The Taliban and Turkmenistan are in talks right now. I got this article 3 days ago. They can't wait to start work on that pipeline again. And as it says below, Turkmenistan seeks security measures with Afghanistan to avoid attacks on pipeline builders as they meet with the Taliban. So watch and see. That's one of the reasons why the Taliban are supposedly going to be playing good. They originally were supposed to protect the pipeline. Now, years later, they will be depended upon. So we have to start making connections. Just as Rashida Tlaib says, I'm starting to connect with pipeline trackers and climate protesters. And what we've got to do is pull it all together and explain how oil is a danger to humankind. That's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. It sure gives us a lot to think about, doesn't it? For those of you who are going to have any questions for Charlotte, this is a good time to write those questions if you want to put them into the chat, because you won't be disturbing her while she speaks. She did a great talk, and I think many of you are kind of blown away by what she said. It's pretty impressive. Next, we're going to have a change of pace. We've been talking about some highly technical things that are wrong in the Middle East. And next we have another member, Marlena Santoyo. Marlena is going to read a poem that will bring our issues down to a more personal level. Marlena, please tell us about the poem and its author, and then read it.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, it was on Tuesday, July 13th, that the family and friends of Palestinian human rights advocate Suha Jarrar laid her to rest in the city of Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank. Missing from her funeral was Suha's mother, Palestinian leader, feminist icon, and despite numerous appeals from Palestinian rights groups, the Israeli Prison Service, or IPS, denied the request for Khalida to be released from prison in order to attend her daughter's funeral. The following letter was read at Suha's funeral and contains Khalida's departing message to her daughter, as it was relayed verbally to her legal team. Imprisoned but free. Letter from the heart from jailed Palestinian leader Khalida Jarrar to her daughter Suha. Gone too soon. I am in so much pain, my child, only because I miss you. I am in so much pain, my child, only because I miss you. From the depths of my agony, I reached out and embraced the sky of our homeland through the window of my prison cell in Damon Prison, Haifa. I stand tall and steadfast, despite the shackles and the jailer. I am a mother in sorrow, from yearning to see you one last time. This doesn't happen except in Palestine. All I wanted was to bid my daughter a final farewell with a kiss on her forehead and to tell her I love her as much as I love Palestine. My daughter, forgive me for not attending the celebration of your life, that I was not beside you during this heartbreaking and final moment. My heart has reached the heights of the sky, yearning to see you, to caress and plant a kiss on your forehead through the small window of my prison cell. Suha, my precious, they have stripped me from building and bidding you a final goodbye kiss. I bid you farewell with a flower. Your absence is searingly painful, excruciatingly painful. But I remain steadfast and strong, like the mountains of beloved Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlena. I think we can all relate to the pain suffered by the human beings who live in such a difficult situation in the Middle East. Our next speaker is Desmura Gatewood, an activist with many groups in the Triangle region of the South. She's going to be addressing the need for Black and Palestinian solidarity, and she'll tell us about her recent trip to the region. Desmura, You need to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. It was saying at first I didn't have the capability to. So hello, everyone. I'm so honored to be here. And I am going to talk a little bit about my experience. As you can see, similar to Marlena, I have my kafia here from Hebron behind me. And I will just go ahead and begin. So I'm often asked, when did I first become aware of Israel's occupation of Palestine? So I remember seeing in the 2000s short news stories of the bombings in Gaza, and I'd heard and seen activists talk about it, but I can't exactly pinpoint the moment prior to the past 2 years that I became aware of it, because the way that the struggle is taught in school, it's almost impossible to understand what's happening until you actually visit, as I did in the late fall of 2018. So what I learned when I was there is that the Palestinian people have not given up. And as an oppressed brown person, Black person in the United States, that's very important. And so as cliche as that sounds, it's also important because I think they'll ultimately be the ones to decide when they've been defeated, and they have not determined that. They're still fighting. I've heard people in the United States basically allude to this idea that Palestine has lost, that Israel has been victorious. But if they've lost, then it wouldn't make sense for them to continue fighting. And they are still fighting. And furthermore, it wouldn't make sense for them to be fought against. And they are still being fought against. Furthermore, there wouldn't still be policies from the United States and Israel to leverage Israel's power over them if this was a done deal. And so that was the lesson I took from this. So even though the United States and Israel, they've literally tried to strip Palestinians of their will to exist, I am reminded anytime I think back to what I saw, that Palestinian people have continued to press on. And it is their pressing on that inspires me to press on in solidarity with them. So I saw this pressing on in the form of mothers who dress their children every day and try to make their lives as normal as possible in refugee camps. I saw this pressing on in the form of boys playing soccer in the street any moment, knowing that this could be their last, or that they could be shot in the legs by IDF soldiers. I saw this pressing on in the form of cooks and farmers who nourish their communities, even as their land and resources continue to diminish. I saw this in the form of teachers introducing fractions and times tables to traumatize students who are fighting to get through the day. I saw this in the form of elders who proudly wear their kafia and traditional embroidery to remember and to continue to honor their ancestors. I saw this in the form of organizations and organizers who dedicate their lives to researching and educating people around the world about the plight of Palestinian people. So when I think about what I can do to increase Black and Palestinian solidarity, one of the things I've learned throughout social movements is that collectivism is the only sustainable strategy. And so my hope is to build local, national, and international strategies with people. And this means listening and learning from people who have ideas and experience, and as well as educating newcomers. There's an international struggle for human rights that needs to continue. Black people in the United States have a unique position because we're very familiar with the ways and workings of the United States oppression, and we're also in proximity to influence the United States policy. So I think Black and Palestinian solidarity looks like Black people consistently holding the United States accountable when they violate the human rights of people at home and abroad. And there are a number of activists, unfortunately, who champion and fight for causes but become absent or even contradictory when those causes become relevant to Palestine. So for me, it's a matter of staying consistent and staying in solidarity with people who are oppressed by policies within the United States and by policies that are coming from the United States. And I'm not going to stop fighting for those people, whether they are here in the United States or whether they are my brothers and sisters from Hebron. And I will close by saying, so if you see my shirt here, I am wearing a shirt that was actually sent to me. This is an example. I call her my sister, my Palestina sister. Her name is Nadia Tanos on the West Coast. She sent me this. This is from the Palestinian Youth Movement. So she sent me this, and I sent her a Black Lives Matters bracelet that I made. And so we are actively practicing Black and Palestinian solidarity. And so it's a beautiful thing to take part in that. And that is my experience. That's my story. That's my witness. And I'm appreciative to have this space to share.
Thank you so much, Desmura. You've given us a few things to think about, and it's very, very personal what we see, and we know that there are going to be questions about everything that we've said. Remember, this is a good time between speakers to write your questions into the chat if you want to do that. You'll have a chance to have discussion and questions and answers at the end of our presentation. And that is going to be happening very soon because I'm the next speaker. And I'll be speaking about our project to promote solidarity between various groups. We're working on getting Hamas removed from the US list of terrorist organizations and getting the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks started once again with all parties participating. After I speak, we'll be opening up for the questions and discussion. And please be ready for that, and note that each audience member is going to be asked to be brief so that everyone will get a chance to participate. It's really important that we have enough space for everyone's voices to be heard. And so I'm going to go ahead and start my talk, and it's a slightly different subject. About 7 years ago, our committee decided to put together a booklet in which we would present an argument in favor of removing Hamas, or Harat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyah, from the US list of terrorist organizations. We wanted to urge that the group be allowed to participate in peace negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. By the time we agreed to do this, the group's abbreviation, HMS, had been turned into the Arabic word Hamas, which means zeal, strength, or bravery. They'd gained quite a following and had run several candidates for office in recent Palestinian elections, winning the majority vote and moving from being an Islamic resistance movement to being the political party that had been chosen in elections deemed to be free and fair as the legitimate government of the Palestinian people. We documented the group's history in our booklet, Hamas at the Middle East Peace Table, Why? I was co-editor with our member Ellen Rosser. Despite Hamas having won the elections, the US and Israel continued to consider the group a terrorist organization and preferred to exclude them from governance, as well as from a seat at the peace table. No Palestinian elections have taken place since then, making Hamas still the officially elected representative of the Palestinian people. We contend that failing to give Hamas and the people it represents a seat at the peace table means that the voices of a large proportion of the people whose future is being discussed at those peace talks are left out. By seating representatives of the PA or the Palestine Authority, but not Hamas, the peace talks are doomed to failure. It's our contention, confirmed by historical record, that the most successful peace negotiations are held between parties who are the most bitter enemies. So let me speak for a moment as a political scientist, which I am. It's well known that those on the Israeli side in the past rounds of talks have represented the full spectrum of viewpoints, including the most extreme positions within Israel. It's also becoming more and more obvious that the Palestine Authority, or PA, which has been playing the role of representative of the Palestinian people, is rapidly losing the confidence of the people it purports to represent. Among the accusations leveled against the PA are that its leadership is acting as a bodyguard for the Israelis, that they've given up too much in past rounds of talks, and that they're toothless in the face of Israeli power. In the most recent round of fighting, which you all saw acted out on television, if the reports that we've been receiving are any indication, the clear winner of the Palestinian hearts and minds is Hamas. Hamas is seen as having tried to defend the beleaguered people of Gaza during the 21-day assault. This is not to say Hamas was faultless in what happened, but international bodies have indicated that Israel exceeded the limits of proportionality in that conflict. So although the US and Israel have made a show of what they call peace talks, with the Israelis on one side and the Palestine Authority on the other, they've managed to avoid the most important issues in the discussion. Without Hamas at the table, those important issues are not being discussed. Our WILPF Palestine section tells us that unity among the Palestinian people is more important now than ever before. They agree with us that Hamas, as the legitimately elected representatives of the Palestinian people, should be among the parties present in any ongoing peace talks. Hamas was mentioned in just about every news report during these recent hostilities. When Egypt brokered a ceasefire, the parties to that agreement were not Israel and the PA, but were Israel and Hamas. And Hamas is in ongoing discussions with Israel at the present time. That in and of itself is an indication that the inclusion of Hamas in peace talks is essential. Our current campaign calls on allies among peace and justice, religious, civil rights, human rights, environmental, and other groups to sign on to our basic premise that Hamas, as the duly elected representative of the Palestinian people, must be removed from the US list of terrorist organizations, and that peace talks must resume between Israel and Palestine, with those talks including all relevant parties. I wrote my master's thesis in 1992 about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and how to resolve it. And I want to quote something from that thesis. Not nice to quote myself, but it's relevant. It's just as true today as it was then. In order for negotiations to be successful, the parties must not only understand the stance of the opposing party, but they must also be willing to sacrifice or make concessions to see that at least some of the goals of their enemy are achieved. In so doing, animosity is reduced and reciprocity is encouraged. Unfortunately, the Palestinians have been forced to make concessions and have gotten little or nothing in return. We believe that Hamas will insist on a stronger negotiating position. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, the US has continued to take the side of Israel, and the Palestinians have not been able to negotiate from a position of strength because they no longer have the Soviet Union on their side. It isn't up to the US, the former Soviet Union, or even any of the so-called confrontation states, those states that border on Israel, including Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, to choose who represents the Palestinian people. Self-determination means that each party needs to decide for itself how it will be governed and by whom. They need to decide who represents them. And in the end, they need to decide on a solution they can live with. We believe that everyone benefits from peace and that war has nothing but losers. So if you believe as we believe, help us by thinking of like-minded groups that might be willing to sign on to our sign-on letter. You'll have a chance to find out about that in our list of actions. And I want to quote my late friend, who was the mayor of Ramallah, Karim Khalaf, used to say, "Believe me, when peace comes, it won't just be peace for the Arabs or peace for the Jews. It will be peace for everyone." And that is our goal. Thank you, everyone.
Hey.
Okay. At this point, we're going to get ready for our question and answer period. A few questions have already been placed into the chat. You can also say that you want to do that by going to, well, it isn't there. Going to reactions and raising your hand. And the person who is going to be monitoring the questions and discussion will be Joan Goddard. So Joan will be handling this from here on out. And we're ready to answer questions and engage in
with the different speakers. And it would be, we could start out with generally, but I think actually the last question that was entered might be a good one to start with. And then we'll get to some of the ones for specific people, because this question is something that people could, it's not actually the last question, but it's close to the last question. It would be something that any one of you who feels that you have the information, including Barb for sure, but quite possibly others of you. Marjorie Van Cleef asks, would one of you talk about the US involvement in the conflict between Palestine and Israel? So if any of the rest of you besides Barb want to talk about that, please get ready. So, because I'll ask you to put up your hand.
Well, I did answer that question regarding the policy. And basically, we are involved, the United States is involved in the creation of arms with Israel. And that's one of the major policy right now. It's the creation of armament, Iron Dome. It's part of our congressional report. And how much money is put on Iron Dome and how much they monitor it, because it's a creation for the future. And everybody is buying this arrow system or this missile defense system in relation to how they work on the ground. So maybe Charlotte wants to say a little more.
No, I think it's so directly linked. The military to support the oil. Where I'm getting an echo on mine for some reason. Do you hear an echo, folks?
No, you're fine.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, one of the things, let me just say this as for the link. As I developed my pipeline consciousness for all these different conflicts, and believe me, it's there for all of them, I would lay out a map and look at the pipelines and then look where was the military posted along the pipeline. But when I was looking at the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which is the one my father was working on, the biggest one of the 20th century, I didn't see where the military was posted. And it suddenly hit me. The military was Israel. Israel is right next to Lebanon. And so, and I've gotten further documentation of it. So when you see all these billions and trillions of dollars going into the Middle East, it's not to defend beleaguered Israel against a hostile sea of Arabs, which is how they have always portrayed it. There is another primary region. It is to protect the oil, which, by the way, is the most important trading commodity in the world. And for that very reason, you don't hear about it. It's not reported in the press. That's why I had to spend decades revealing that. I have a book here by a Canadian, and he talks about it. It's absolutely critical to understand the role of oil because it connects all these different struggles. And Desmura, I would certainly like to follow up with you. I think it's wonderful that you're making these connections.
I also wanted to answer that. So if we're talking about the U.S. involvement, I mean, we don't have to look any further than the fact that we send them $10 million a day. I didn't know if someone was saying, can you, okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. We send them $10 million a day, about $3.8 billion a year in military aid. And I will say, as a Black person who is surrounded by people that are in poverty and people that are deprived from public school funding, and people who are deprived from healthcare and fair wages, that is absolutely insulting to send $10 million a day and $3.8 billion in military aid, not even to our own military, but to someone else's military. So I think that the U.S. has literally invested more in apartheid elsewhere than they have in even investing in the least of these, as the Bible would consider it, here in the United States. So that to me is about as enough of evidence as you need about the U.S. involvement in Palestine. So that's my answer.
I would like to add that there's an organization that many of you have heard called AIPAC. And AIPAC has put so much pressure on individual members of Congress to the point where when people speak up, they're maligned. Even the notion of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and what recently was done by Ben and Jerry's, they're put in such a position as though they're opposed to democracy and freedom, rather than respecting the right to public speaking and to expressing one's ideas.
I want to just add that in the 10 visits that I've made to the Middle East, one of the terms that comes up most frequently is honest broker. They've asked for the US to be an honest broker. And what does that mean? It means that instead of taking one side or another, that the US should take the side of peace, which is what we hope as WILPF we are doing. At various times, we side with different people because they are the victims in different situations. I was in Jerusalem and in a meeting, and I was called out with the rest of our members to go and watch on television as the Soviet Union fell. We were at the time with one of the leaders of the Palestinians, and he told us that he could see that we were happy, and it seemed like a good thing to the US, but that for the Palestinian people, it was a tragedy because there was no longer a major superpower supporting the Palestinians, while the Israelis still had the US on their side. And so we don't want to have the US taking sides. We want the US to be an honest broker.
Okay, so partly related to this business of funding, I think, is a recent question. Are any of you familiar enough and want to say something about the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, I guess, training of US police?
Yeah, so in Durham, North Carolina, which is very close to where I live, there was an initiative to end the exchange program from police officers in Durham, North Carolina, to be trained in Israel on military tactics. So of course, these are military tactics that they would come back and use on citizens here in the United States. And so we were actually paying the state of Israel to train our people to then come back and use the tactics that they're, I'm assuming, using against Palestinian people. Furthermore, what's also interesting is if you look at the tear gas canisters, for example, and I think someone talked about this, that are used against protesters, protesting against protesting on behalf of Black Lives Matters, like in Ferguson. These same tear gas canisters are the tear gas canisters made in the United States that are then sent to Israel that are used to supposedly disperse crowds of protesters in Palestine. However, just like here, sometimes tear gas doesn't discriminate. So of course, people can inhale it that are children, pregnant women have talked about having miscarriages. People, when we were actually in Palestine, picked up tear gas canisters that showed us that they were made in Pennsylvania. So literally our law enforcement interests are very similar. And so what the IDF does there is very similar to what the United States police do here. And there is a very obvious exchange program. And so I did want to affirm what someone mentioned in the chat. Dear Marion Thompson, it's very good to see you also.
Could I just add, well, I was watching the police brutality in the past couple of years. I felt really aggravated because people don't know that a lot of the police forces have been militarized and they've been trained by Israel. And it makes absolute sense. I mean, the Israelis are the experts at putting down Palestinian revolts. So of course they've got the tools to share in the US. And I was going to ask Desmura, how much does the Black Lives Matter movement understand the role of Israel in training the police?
Very much so. And so I would say the movement for Black lives would probably be more accurate now because Black Lives Matters is more so of a philosophy, but the movement for Black lives is a coalition of organizations like Black Youth Project, Dream Defenders, a lot of which who are mentored by people like Angela Davis, Kwame Ture, known as Stokely Carmichael, other former members of SNCC. That did a lot of pro-Palestine, free Palestine, Black and Palestinian liberation initiatives over the last few decades. So this is constantly looked at throughout the world, a lot of the similarities between state violence and between the state violence that's enacted against oppressed people. And there are a lot of Black activists in the United States that have gone to Palestine and done delegations and have come back and made those links. And it is really the only way that people here have hope that there will be some sort of change is if there is international solidarity and international strategies and tactics that are used to fight similar struggles.
And
so there's a lot of
and some solidarity in the United States also. Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, in sort of related ideas, different groups than Desmura was talking about, but there was a question about the relationship between Palestinians and the First Nations people, Native Americans. And has that continued and so on? And Jan Porterman put a note in the chat just very recently that there was a very small cadre of Palestinian youth who traveled to stand with the Standing Rock tribe during the pipeline struggle.
Yeah.
So does anybody want to expand on that, or should we let Jan's good item stand for that?
I would like to address it briefly.
Great.
That is so heartening. And I have in my book at the very end an example of a Palestinian woman who wrote a poem showing her realization that they are both victims of a colonial oppressive mechanism, and that they have to unite. And I think this is the beautiful message that's come out of this session, also through Rashida Tlaib. The way we are going to change Middle East policy is when we start connecting, we start uniting. So I am in the process of connecting with what we're calling pipeline trackers. And we may have a website, but we will be connecting with climate activists and with the people, indigenous groups fighting the pipelines. There's a commonality to all of it. And I think it's very exciting. I'm very hopeful that out of this terrible, terrible time that we've gone through, there will be a rebirth of global consciousness and connectivity.
Wonderful. Does anyone else want to comment on it? We do need to keep in mind that our time is limited, but we do have several more questions of different categories and so on. Okay, so again, I'm going to go with one of these later ones and get organized to go back like I just did. That was actually the first question. Okay, so the last question, although there's probably a new one coming here now, how can the defense of the illegal apartheid that Israel was created out of World War II's decision among allies, and thus the defense for it says it is legal, how can this formation of Israel by decree essentially be reversed, quote, legally in the courts of the UN at The Hague?
Barbara, you want to take that one?
That's what I was going to say, Charlotte.
The heavy one.
It's a very tough question. I've talked with a lot of Palestinians and a lot of Israelis throughout the years. And I still remember that one man we spoke with who later became one of the prime ministers, and I'm not going to say who he was, but he said that his parents wouldn't let him forget the Holocaust, and that he had sympathy for the Palestinians because he understood what they were going through, but he couldn't forget the Holocaust because of his parents. At the same time, I have heard Palestinians say that they understand what happened in the Holocaust and that they are being accused of not being sympathetic to what the Jewish people have gone through. I think there needs to be more of a person-to-person relationship so that people can get to know each other and not fear each other, and that is how change will happen. It's not going to happen by decree. I really believe it will happen with person-to-person relationships, and that is, I can say, going to the heart of the matter.
I would just like to add that Saudi Arabia and its oil played a big role in America's failure to rescue the Jews. And I cite it briefly in my book. My husband's going to do a much bigger book on the subject, which we call Oil and the Holocaust. And the whole concept is that when there was discussions about rescuing Jews in the spring of 1943, some people thought that bombing Auschwitz would end the killing machine. But then there was this concern that Israeli prisoners who had been released would stream down to Palestine. And the powers that be were very worried about that because Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, did not want this to happen. He did not want more Jewish immigration to Palestine, soon to become Israel. And he threatened American oil interests if this happened. And so we find in around 43 and 44, some of the early Jewish settlers that did make it to Palestine were the first to carry slogans about oil, no blood for oil. They were the first. They got it. We got to remind people of that. In other words, Jews have been screwed, Arabs have been screwed, Armenians. I mean, you start putting the whole picture together and it's shocking and outrageous. And indigenous people. That's why there has to be an even broader global coalition against the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I have been many times to Israel and Palestine, and I have been amazed by the amount of projects between Palestinian and Israeli for peace. Whether it was musicians for peace, doctors for peace, artists for peace, I have seen many people reaching out one to another. I think the biggest struggle is those 3.8 billion that we give for armament and for experimentation of armament over the Palestinian people. So it is the state, it's not a problem between people, it's a problem with the armament, the state, and the pipeline.
I was just going to say on the same subject. So I'm agreeing that it may not be resolved by decree, also because the United Nations has already said that the settlements are illegal. This has already been confirmed by the United Nations that Israel fits the definition of apartheid. The problem, as Omar Bogarty, I think that's how you. Yes, we met with him. He said that the United Nations has no teeth. They have already acknowledged over and over again that this is a human rights atrocity. But when you have Donald Trump, for example, who's in office, that is going to defy anything that the United Nations says, or when you have certain people in office on another party that are bending to AIPAC and taking money, I mean, it's really difficult to enforce anything that the United Nations says if the United Nations cannot enforce what the United Nations says.
All right, I need to cut in here and let everyone know that our time is rapidly running out, and it may already have run out.
No, not quite.
Not quite, but we are supposed to get out in time for the next group to come on. I want to say that this is a great conversation we have going, and I'm springing this on our panel and our committee members, but I think perhaps we should have an open discussion via Zoom that we welcome people to participate in. We have a number of unanswered questions, and I think we can carry those forward. But meanwhile, Jan, I think, has a list of action items that she's going to put into the chat. And there's also a way to contact us that should go into the chat. And if you are interested and you go on our Middle East Committee's website, or maybe Jan can tell us how people can get to read this list and come into action. And we will send out a message to everyone telling you that we will be convening discussions because we want this to be an ongoing conversation. I think that's a good thing to do. I hope there's nobody who objects to us doing that, but I think it is important and a way for us to continue to move forward. And we do invite anyone who wants to join our committee to do so, and please be in touch with us. Odile, do you have any closing words you would like to say?
No, somebody had said that we should open a new office in Israel for peace. Well, I think we should bring the peace table to Israel, definitely again. But I just wanted to say overall, we do have to work for peace on both sides. And there is many Jewish organizations as well as Israelis that are working for peace, and we cannot discount that. And I was part of Women in Black for a long time, which started in Israel also. So there is very active people on both sides. And we have to continue working on trying to reach out to both sides. I agree with that. But if we stop the US from investing in armament, that would be a very big thing. And also, we understood more the role of pipeline. So I invite everyone that wants to continue this work to join the Middle East Peace and Justice Action Committee. And if you have any other passion, just join us and we can help you develop them. Thank you.
Can I say a closing thing?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, look, my book came out during the lockdown in April of last year. Everything got canceled. It really hurt it. I'm trying to rejuvenate it. And by the way, you might be interested to know that my publisher, Chelsea Green, does their annual summer book sale, and you can get the book very much discounted. I would suggest you check it out. As Naomi Wolf once said, once you see the maps, you can't unsee the maps. And I've got pipeline maps for all the different countries. And what I want is for people to have the information. So you might just want to check that out. And maybe we'll get a new life for this book that will help us in the connectivity. I'm certainly not going to make a lot of money on it. I promise that is not my ambition. My ambition is to educate.
I wanted to add that we have a member of the Lebanese section with us, with the Middle East Committee in the US, and she's presenting a film. Barbara told us already about it, but I just want to remind you of that because it's important to see what's going on in Lebanon right now. It's pretty terrible. And the US is building a huge embassy there. So there is more coming. So please look at everything. And thank you for Desmura to being part of us and to really give us a wonderful testimony of her travels there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I was just told that we have a few more minutes because the next speakers aren't here yet. And so maybe we can do another question or so. I want to make sure that that everyone saw what was put in the chat, and you all know that you can save the chat by going to the three dots on the bottom and saving it, and then you might want to print it out. It will print out kind of as a strange transcript, but you'll be able to read it, and that's a good thing to do.
I can offer a question that's not specific to any particular talk that you gave, but more about the situation. At least one person has mentioned being concerned that the committee and the questions and the discussion seem to be focused mostly on Palestinians and the question of how the Palestinians and the Israelis could possibly work together. I think Barb has mentioned the concept of you don't negotiate just with your friends, but if there are, is something else that somebody wants to say in terms of the fact that, there is, I think, a great deal of imbalance between the two groups, countries, whatever you want to say, and how do we, as our committee and other people who are Palestinian allies primarily, perhaps, deal with that question of how how the conflict is seen in the United States. Some people seeing it as Israel is great, wonderful, and perfect, and other people saying, look, the Palestinians,
up against. If you look at that map and you see the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel wants to be an energy corridor and build pipelines all along the eastern shores. And guess what countries are in the way? Can you guess? You probably not, because you're not that familiar with the geography as I am. The countries are Lebanon and Syria. Now let's look at what has happened to them. Lebanon is completely flattened. It's a horrific situation. And Syria isn't doing well either. The Russians are in there helping, and they're probably going to survive through rebuilding, but they're in dire situation too. So I just want to say that when you're looking at making connections and all of that, you should also adopt a geopolitical perspective. That is, don't just look at one region, look at the totality of the region and understand that there are forces that are working behind the scenes and underground, competing against each other, constantly competing against each other. It's going on in the Mediterranean right now. And just keep that in mind. It's difficult. We're up against a huge, look, pipelines were called the arteries of the empire. They are to be protected at all costs. So we're up against a lot.
Yes, and
Okay.
I just
We've
want
been given the word that our time
Yeah.
is up.
that the Palestinian children who are in jail in Israel, we're working on trying, so please reach out to your representative. It's a Betty McCollum resolution to help the Palestinian children who are in jail in Israel. Thank you.
May I say that Marlena had her hand up and she has not spoken much?
2590.
Okay, I would like to briefly say that what we as citizens of the United States, what we can do is really put the pressure on this government and this country. And to see the international relationships, be it Native Americans, African Americans, and Palestinians as a worldwide struggle. And there are people, including myself, who are members of Jewish Voice for Peace and other organizations that hold our own responsible. And that's what you and I can do. And I hope whether it's whistleblowers such as Julian Assange or others who have come to light, who are putting their lives at jeopardy and willing to reveal what it is that Republicans and Democrats are doing in our name, that hopefully we can strengthen our solidarity.
Thank you to the whole Middle East Peace and Justice Action Committee for spelling out the interconnections to us. And that's the specialty of WILPF US. We do need to wrap up now so we can move on to the next program. Are we okay, Barbara? Okay, ET, please.